My name is Jeremy Wiebe. I work at the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation, and I'm an associate of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. I also teach history here at the University of Winnipeg. It's my pleasure this morning to chair the opening session of this conference. Much of my work with the Plett Foundation this year has related to the commemoration of the Mennonite migration to Mexico and Paraguay in the 1920s. This conference feels like something of a capstone to a busy year of activity. We will begin shortly with this panel, titled Mobile Families Across Space and Time, with presentations that delve into stories and analysis of the migration. We will hear from the four panelists in turn in the order they are listed in your program. Now to the introductions. Bruce Hiebert, at the far left, teaches business ethics and strategy at University Canada West in Vancouver, British Columbia. His current research focuses on decision theory, especially the relationship between emotion and moral decision-making. Central to this research has been his analysis of the demographic impacts of Mennonite community decision-making. He completed his PhD at Simon Fraser University in 2008 with a dissertation on Mennonite historical, theological, and gender ethics. Aileen Friesen is an associate professor in history and a co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies here at the University of Winnipeg. She is also the executive director of the Plett Foundation. Aileen is the author of Colonizing Russia's Promised Land, Orthodoxy and Community on the Siberian Steppe, and the editor of the Russian Mennonite Story, The Heritage Cruise Lectures by Paul Taves. She is also editor of the historical magazine Preservings. Ernest Braun was a high school English teacher, and after his retirement, spent 10 years in business before devoting his time and energies to local Mennonite history. He has published in various Mennonite periodicals and co-edited the comprehensive historical atlas of the East Reserve. His hobby is Low German, and he co-edited a new High German version of Jack Thiessen's Low German Dictionary, published in Germany in 2019. Tina Fehr Kehler is a freelance writer and consultant. She worked for MCC Manitoba as the program coordinator for Low German Mennonite services in Winkler for over 13 years until the program closed in 2019. Currently, she is a co-creator, co-writer, co-director, and co-producer of an upcoming TV series called Maria and the Mennos. Perhaps you will share something about that with us. Tina received an MA in sociology in 2006 from the University of Manitoba and has conducted research with Low German-speaking Mennonites in Manitoba and Mexico. We will begin now with Bruce Hiebert and his paper, From Russia to Mexico, The Demographics of Mennonite Migration.
Thanks. Excuse me, I'm still coughing up Abbotsford smoke. I don't know if anybody's seen the weather, the smoke, so my apologies for my voice. That is literally what I'm doing. So now I have to figure out how to make this. How do I? The green button. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Getting used to the technology. Anyway, this is a follow-up to a presentation I made. No, actually, it's a follow-up to research I did about 20 years ago, and starting to try and figure out some of the dynamics that I did then. And I'm working on some models of what makes Mennonite thinking work, what's going on there. And so this is a research report. That is, there's no formal paper behind this yet because I don't know what I'm talking about. I just know what I'm observing. So this is a research report. I'm really open to any thoughts people have about what is going on because there's some peculiar stuff here. So this is coming from Mennonite demographic records. So I'll take you through it. What I did here is I followed three families. The births of the eldest of them, 2 men and 1 woman, is actually in the Danzig. So I followed those three families out for up to 7 generations. following where they migrated, and then what are the demographic characteristics of those three families. Some complex stuff about defining who is which. Are they Russian? Are they Canadian? Are they Mexican? This is a bit arbitrary, and it shows up, unfortunately. What I ended up with are what are called 631 life course reconstructions, with 113 identified as being born in South Russia, 337 in Canada, and 164 in Mexico, then 17 others, Paraguay and the USA. You can quibble with exactly which countries they belong to, because they can be born in one, raised in another, and die in a third. People are highly migratory, and it's a really interesting dynamic. Basic pattern, you all know this one. So and this is just the families I'm following. So you've got the Russia to Manitoba, Manitoba to Mexico, but there's a lot of other movement that goes on in there. Mennonites are not particularly stable, which is a different factor entirely. So what am I trying to do? I'm doing a historical demographic study. What we're looking for is the way, what the numbers are and how they shift depending on various factors. And then we try and read from those numbers shifting what is going on. That is, can we see what's going on in the environment, economic conditions, cultural conditions? Because, I mean, people have done work on the relationship of family size to the price of grain. And there is a correlation. It's not strong, but it is there. Things like physical stressors, which I think are a big part of the Manitoba experience. We'll come to that. That is, the environment is so horrible. My apologies to those of you born and raised here, but this is not a pleasant place to be, and it really shows in the numbers. What we do it is through what are called cohort studies, and I'm looking at what are called regional cohorts. Age cohorts are the standard model. That is, people born in a certain period. I'm looking at people born in a certain region. Then looking at things, there are many factors you can look at. I'm looking at life length, age of marriage, family size, and family composition. And there are lots of other factors. Gender shows up, not much in this study, but a little bit. You can do some powerful stuff around gender analysis. So life length, this is variable 1. Very simply, very quickly, the best life conditions, oddly enough, are in Canada. But are they? And I don't think this is true. This is the interesting thing about statistics. What do they mean? The number is that the average life expectancy for Canadian Mennonites is longer than it is for the others. But not by much, and it's not huge, and I think the numbers are actually wrong. I think the life expectancy is actually lowest in Canada. But that shows up elsewhere. But it says, the problem here is the records. Who keeps the records? What are they recording? And it's clear in the records that Mennonites do not pay much attention to infants who die before the age of 1. That is, they often don't get into the records. Sometimes they do, and often they do not. So that's, I think, where the big mortality issue is, and we'll see that. I love scatter plots. I know some people think that they are the epitome of evil for statisticians. I love them. Anyway, because there's so much you can read in them. So this is the life length. I removed deaths under the age of 19 because that is where the skew takes place. And then there's also sample truncation. That is, people were still alive. The longer living people were still alive when the data was being collected. And that's that upper right-hand corner. So you can see that life length is all over the place and kind of not that far apart, actually. We'll just ignore that one. So not much change. So Canada, Mexico, Russia, not a lot of difference. Age of first marriage. Now here's where we start showing up, things start showing up that are different. So, age of first marriage is a strong cultural indicator in the research literature. So if you start seeing things change there, you know something is going on. The question is what? And what immediately stands out is that the age of first marriage for men or women, well, men it's the same pretty much right across the board. Nothing changes. But for women, there's something very strange happening, is that they're getting married on average 2 years later, or even the mode, which is the single most common age, moves up from age 19 to age 21. That is a big shift. That is a strange shift. it says something is happening in Manitoba that did not happen in Mexico, did not happen in Russia. What? I don't know. But look at what we get to next. So I dug into that. Because the sample size is large enough, I can actually do a little bit of regression analysis. Can't go far, and the numbers now begin to get a little bit fuzzy. But what you see is something that's happening here that is just odd. Mennonites women who stay in Canada are getting married considerably later, like 4 years later than the norm, whereas the women who end up moving to Mexico are getting married at the traditional age. This is, I have no clue, but something is going on here. The women are thinking differently. What is happening? So this is an inadvertent gender analysis, not where I intended to go, but this is what immediately shows up when you look at that initial number. Why 2 years? Well, it's because half of them are actually waiting 4 years, and the other half are doing things at the traditional cultural age, and they're packing up and moving to Mexico. So that's the beginning of the strange stuff. It gets weirder. Look at these numbers. This is family size. This is for the sample size as a whole. I've got some follow-up information that I think makes a little bit more sense of this. But you'll notice that Russian family size is pretty large. Canadian, initially, it's pretty large. And you get to Mexico and it's even larger. So these are what are called approaching a natural fertility level, though as any of us who have any philosophical sophistication know, that isn't a natural fertility level. There is no such thing as a natural fertility level. What it really is the maximal normal fertility in an agrarian community. Okay? That is, the maximal normal fertility in an agrarian community is 10 babies on average per woman over her life. And if you're interested, it's called the Hutterite Index. Anyway, but here we have numbers that are just short of that in Mexico, a little significantly short of that in Canada and in South Russia in the early period, and then it drops like a stone. And Mennonite family size, completed family size, once they've decided to stay in Canada, this is for the group that stays in Canada, is just a fraction. What is going on? In fact, oddly enough, a lot of this drop is in fact taken into account by the changing age of first marriage. That in itself is responsible for most of this gap. That is, when women marry older, they have fewer babies over their lifespan. And their highest fertility is when they're young. If they're not getting married at 19, instead they're getting married at 26, that's a lot of babies that are disappearing. And this seems to be where they're the source of this. So it's an interesting connection, interesting thing going on there. Here's another lovely scatter plot. This one gets really interesting because we start looking at it, the Russian in the blue and the Mexican in the orange, they're kind of grouped in a very similar kind of way, but the Canadian is doing that. So this gets at something else which is going on, which is it's in fact a drop over time. It's a huge drop over time, and it's almost a straight line. So the whole numbers are of a distinct drop in size, but if you start looking at the trajectory is in some respects is even more significant. That is, the average is high early and low later. And it just moves down in a very linear way. Now, what is going on? Very different from the Mexican or the Russian experience. And note that this is pre-birth control era. Something is happening. Fertility control is taking place, or fertility management, let's call it that. How is that happening? Actually, that's interesting. One of the interesting things that nobody wants to look at in demography, which is in Western fertility starts dropping at the turn of the century in a very controlled manner. That is, women are controlling fertility starting from about 1900. And how? And nobody wants to really look at that. We all talk about, well, the birth control pill in 1960 changed everything. Actually, it didn't change anything statistically. Fertility management has been going on for a long time. How is it being done? Well, that would be an interesting study, and I can't get access to that information because nobody will talk. Now we're into the more interesting stuff. Well, except for this one, number of marriages, you can see it's slightly higher in Russia than in Canada or Mexico. Not much higher, but in most of that, the higher rate of marriage has to do with later life mortality. Many of the men and women are remarrying late in life because their spouses died. So that's why the slightly higher number in Russia. And then this is the truly weird stuff. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, maybe 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what is going on. So what I've done here is you've got 3 categories. We've got lots of babies to count. What I did is I looked at the child-birth-sex ratio. This is one thing demographers love to look at because it is a key indicator of gender dynamics. It's also an indicator of economic dynamics and other cultural things. That is, when you start looking at how many baby boys are born, how many baby girls are born, you can tell a lot about what's going on inside a group, a community, a nation. So there's lots of studies on this stuff. There aren't lots of studies done on this stuff among Mennonites, and I think one of the reasons why is because it would confuse everybody, because this breaks all the standard models. This is not anything you can find in any existing literature. Mennonites are doing something different around boys and girls. And it's such a violation. I can't publish this stuff. I haven't, it is just too weird. It's way outside norms. So if you start looking down the left-hand column, South Russia, the normal range is 103 to 106 baby boys are born for every baby girl. Anything outside of that is something is going on. And you'll note that the Russian average is pretty close to that. We can put it down to record, except when you get down to the second-born child tends to be female. The third-born tends to be male. That's odd. What's going on there? The third-born being male, actually, that's a really common pattern in agrarian cultures. That is, later born tend to have a rise in the number of baby boys who survive infancy. What's going on? The odd one is that the second-born are heavily girls. What is happening there? Odd. Mennonites look like, if there is such a thing, the only culture on the planet that could be identified as having both a boy preference and a girl preference. That is, cultures are typically boy preference cultures or girl preference cultures, and boy preference cultures outnumber girl preference by about 10 to 1. This is the only culture that seems to show up with both. At least I can't find anything in any records. And if somebody can find some, please let me know. But this looks like the only one. Then you get to Canada, and the numbers go really crazy. Now we got a strong, very strong girl preference, except if you look down at the fourth-born boy in the early period, this is an outrageously high number. 147 point whatever, baby boys born for baby girls. Weird. Odd, way off the charts. And then also crazy is the really low ratio of baby boys, or the high ratio of baby girls to baby boys before that. And then when you shift down to the later size, now we have this really consistent boy preference all the way through. Now this is also when we've got smaller family sizes. And that, I think, is a key part of it. And then in Mexico, now we're looking at something closer to actually what might be a normal agrarian kind of culture, except for the firstborn is most likely to be a girl. Now that, again, makes no sense. This is not a standard cultural pattern. So what are we looking at here? The normal theory is that this would indicate very careful patterns of gender and birth order infanticide. That is, the traditional model would say that this is, Mennonites are deciding this baby boy lives for some reason, this baby girl lives in this position for some odd reason, and the other sex gets to die. Okay, that is the traditional model. It is what I said in my dissertation. I wish Roy Lowen were here, because we got into an argument over this. I recant is not infanticide. This is too crazy for infanticide. There's something else going on, but it's taken me 15 years to figure out what might be going on. I think what is happening here is that it is stress-related health care of neonatals in a culture that doesn't record neonatal deaths. I think that can account for all of this stuff. And that what we're looking at are families that are really concerned for the health of particular children when all children get very, very sick and many of them die. As soon as we take, if that is the model, I can make sense of all of this stuff. But that's not in the literature. It's not an existing model. And if I'm going to present it as a model, I've got more work to do, and this is beginnings of that very research. I've got other data pools that are much larger, but they don't get at this quite the same way this kind of information does. Anyway, to wrap up then, conclusions. My conclusion is the Mexicans and the Russians are doing pretty much the same thing and experiencing life in very similar ways. In Manitoba is the difference. There's something going on in Manitoba at many levels relating to child survival and women's behavior. What exactly is going on? I don't know. Hypotheses, one, I think this is probably true, that there are much worse child health conditions in Manitoba, and that explains pretty much everything. But also, potentially, World War I might have transformed women's expectations around their own lives. I don't know how you'd define it, but that's the only historical event that seems to line up with the shift among Mennonite women. I've done some work with Kansas women, and there seems to be a split in the Kansas communities between the women and men over conscientious objection. Again, now that's a huge data pool, 3,500, much larger. I think I can see it there. This is much smaller. I get these differences, but there's no way to really define them with clarity. So if somebody's got some ideas, happy to talk about them. Light Foundation for funding this, for Ben, and Candace Dennis, who really helped me, a friend of mine, who reviewed this data with me and said, no, women are doing things, they're thinking things. Come on, don't just lump them into the cultural porridge pot. Women are active and thinking. So she said, okay, I'll put it in as a hypothesis. Women are thinking. All right, there we go.
On that note, I'm up here to show that women are indeed thinking. Okay, so I'm Aileen Friesen, and now I'm here as a professor, not as the executive director of the Platt Foundation, and I am going to be presenting today a paper called Our Kind of Mennonites, the Old Colony, the Russlaender, and Themes of Migration. So beginning in 1922, 8,000 Mennonites from communities in Saskatchewan and Manitoba migrated from Canada to Mexico after being unable to find accommodation with provincial governments over the issue of private Mennonite schools. The following year, 1923, approximately 3,000 Mennonites arrived from Ukraine to Canada, following a path through Latvia and England before arriving on the shores of Quebec City. As historian Royden Lohan has noted, the migration to Mexico was the largest organized voluntary exodus in Canadian history. And as historian Frank Epp has noted, the migration of 21,000 Mennonites from the Soviet Union to Canada during the 1920s was the, quote, largest organized voluntary mass movement of Mennonites in history. Both migrations fundamentally altered the trajectory of Mennonite communities, yet they are treated by scholars as separate phenomena, two events that happened at the same time but are unrelated. In part, this is true. In their quest to migrate, each group responded to domestic issues, the school question in the case of the migration to Mexico, and anarchy, the Civil War, and the Bolshevik victory in the case of the migration to Canada. However, from an immigration perspective, these migrations are linked by the Order in Councils of May 1st and June 9th, 1919, in which the Canadian government banned the immigration of Mennonites, Hutterites, and Doukhobors, labeling these groups to be undesirable for citizenship. During the political debates that preceded the Order in Councils, we can find the emergence of the theme There are Mennonites and Mennonites, meaning that some Mennonites were open to adapting, meaning that the government thought that some Mennonites were open to adapting to Canadian ways, while others were considered simply lost causes, a waste of Canadian resources. This demonstrates a shift in thinking from the idea that assimilation was possible, perhaps requiring an extra generation to push along the process, to a conviction that certain types of Mennonites simply had no place in Canada. This development, the consolidation of a notion of the right kind of Mennonite, influenced how some Mennonites presented themselves to government, especially while negotiating the lifting of the ban on immigration. As scholars such as Valerie Knowles have demonstrated, after the end of the First World War, the Canadian government turned from prioritizing economic considerations to issues of cultural and ideological suitability when determining who they wanted to bring into Canada. This change in policy is especially apparent in debates in the House of Commons over the new Immigration Act in 1919, which introduced highly restrictive measures to immigration, and in the two orders and councils banning Mennonites, Hutterites, and Doukhobors from immigrating to Canada. The debates in the House of Commons preceding the two orders in council, I'm going to keep making that mistake, orders in council, offers a window into how the government viewed Mennonites and their place in Canadian society. So just to refresh everyone's memories, Mennonite communities in Manitoba and Saskatchewan had experienced an intense period of conflict with provincial governments over the question of German language private schools, intensified by Mennonite exemption from military service during the First World War. And in 1919, with the war winding down, the issue of immigration was strongly on the minds of government officials. In the House of Commons, the immigration of a group of Mennonites, they were actually Hutterites, but they were called Mennonites in the debates, to Canada from the United States ignited a debate about whether Mennonites were acceptable immigrants. On April 8, 1919, the MP from Neepawa asked the government if it had, quote, received any protests, end of quote, from Western Canada about this immigration, and if so, whether any action would be taken. The Minister of the Interior, Arthur Meighen, answered the question on behalf of the Minister of Immigration, J.A. Calder, who was traveling at the time, confirming that indeed objections had been heard from the public related to three areas. First, exemption from military service. Second, the special school and language privileges for the children of these groups, and the idea that these groups would resist enforcement of school laws. And finally, that these groups lived in communities and were a detriment to the other settlers living in the same vicinities. On April 29th, Calder had the opportunity to respond for himself as the government considered the new immigration bill. Calder reflected on how the war had changed public perceptions on immigration and stated that the government position on, quote, peculiar sects, end of quote, like Mennonites and Doukhobors, and this is what he said about these groups, quote, we should be free to shut out any class of people that we don't think can be readily assimilated. If there are any peculiar peoples the world round whose customs and beliefs, whose ideals and modes of life are dissimilar to ours, and who are not likely to become Canadian citizens, we have the right to put up bars and keep them out. Without discussing the matter further, I may tell the House and the people that the government proposes to do that so far as these peculiar classes of people are concerned, end of quote. In other words, days before the first order in council, the government signaled that it planned to take action against peculiar sects, and Mennonites were included among those groups. The debate continued the next day on the Immigration Act with William Ashbury Buchanan, Member of Parliament for Lethbridge, weighing in on the issue of Hutterite and Mennonite immigration. The school question once again provided evidence for why Mennonites should not be allowed to immigrate to Canada, with Buchanan criticizing Mennonites for sending their children to German language schools run by their own teachers, and repeating the assessment that those unwilling to assimilate should be categorized as undesirable citizens. In addition to banning the entry of these quote, undesirable groups, one MP took the matter even further and advocated their deportation from Canada. While the issue of deportation of Mennonites, Hutterites, and Doukhobors failed to gain support in the debate, the members of Parliament encouraged the government not to wait to pass a bill on immigration before taking action. As an MP from East Calgary stated, "I think the government should be well advised to take advantage of the provision of the War Measures Act and pass an order in council to exclude these groups until such a time as the bill might become law." Not everyone supported a wholesale ban on Mennonites, and this is where we get the phrase, "there are Mennonites and Mennonites," to indicate recognition that some Mennonites had adapted to government expectations and therefore should be considered in a different category. Even though Member of Parliament William Steele of Perth South supported the formation of a new immigration policy for Canada, which placed citizenship and assimilation as the most significant considerations for immigration, he also defended Mennonites in Ontario, whom he considered to be proper citizens, showing full engagement with Canadian society in every aspect except military service. He was joined by William Euler, Member of Parliament for Waterloo North, and J.M. Douglas of Alberta, who pointed out the prosperity created by immigration to Canada's west through immigration, and also blamed weak provincial governments in contrast to Alberta, who had never allowed language exemption to begin with, but that's a different story. So these men did not offer a wholesale defense of Mennonites, but introduced a different portrait of Mennonites as people whose peculiarities did not preclude them from being full citizens. The Minister of Immigration was not entirely unsympathetic to this portrait. In another debate, Calder admitted that not all Mennonites adhered to this strict lifestyle, and that some Mennonites in Western Canada had, quote, broken away from the old ideas and make very desirable citizens, end of quote. Yet, he still identified the Old Colony School question as a key issue for consideration over the entry of more Mennonites into Canada. He shared his experience meeting with 6 Old Colony leaders and contended that, quote, they have not seen their way clear on the school question. He maintained, quote, so long as a large section of these people hold out against coming under the education laws of the Western provinces, an agitation will prevail to exclude them from entering into Canada, end of quote. Under these circumstances, even the existence of progressive Mennonites could not change Calder's mind. This ban on immigration did not affect Old Colony leaders who were searching for new lands to enable their people to leave Canada. It did, however, influence the prospect of Mennonites from what would become the Soviet Union who were searching for a new home after experiencing anarchy and civil war. As Mennonites in Canada became interested in helping their co-religionists in the Soviet Union immigrate, the existence of the Order in Council represented a significant roadblock. To counter that claim, Mennonites tailored their arguments to Canadian government officials to address these key concerns. They pitched themselves, so themselves being Mennonites in Canada, and Mennonites in the Soviet Union as being the right kind of Mennonites. We can see this positioning most clearly in a series of correspondence sent to the Minister of Immigration, Calder, in 1921 from a number of key Canadian Mennonites and also from A.A. Friesen, who was a representative of Mennonites in the Soviet Union. They all emphasized language, the willingness of Mennonites to learn the language of the land, schools, the willingness of Mennonites to educate their children at high levels, and also the industriousness of the people. While the other Mennonite delegates stepped lightly around the issue of Old Colony Mennonites and their migration to Mexico, A.A. Friesen directly addressed this issue in his follow-up letter to the Minister of Immigration, linking the 1919 Order in Council directly to the issue of assimilation and issues with that community. He stated that if this had actually been about military service, so that was another idea, that they're being banned because of military service and their exemption from military service, A.A. Friesen claimed that if it had been about military service, then Quakers would also have been banned. And then he goes on to argue, give the same arguments about how Mennonites within Canada and the United States had shown themselves to be open to assimilation, and that Mennonites coming from the Soviet Union would be no different. This approach did not convince the Conservative government at the time, but it did sway Mackenzie King's incoming Liberal government. Before this happens, however, the mass migration of Mennonites to Mexico would begin. And it didn't go unnoticed in the House of Commons. At the beginning of April 1922, nearly a month after the first train of Mennonites had left Plum Coulee, one of the members of Parliament asked 5 questions, first trying to establish whether the government was aware that Mennonites from Western Canada were leaving Canada and moving to Mexico, and the next questions can be summarized as what's happening with the land and whether or not a large group would be taking it over, and who the government might be negotiating with. And the minister at that time responded, yes, that they were aware that all of these Mennonites were leaving for Mexico, but had no other information to offer. The government quickly moved on to other concerns, that is, people coming into the country. The Liberal government will issue another order in council on June 1st, 1922, which rescinded the original orders and allowed, once again, for the immigration of Mennonites, Hutterites, and Doukhobors. The House of Commons debate at the end of May hints at this change on the horizon. When the leader of the opposition asked a question about this issue, the Minister of the Interior responded that arrangements hadn't been made yet, but he couldn't see why this ban should continue. It seems that at the time, it seems like memories had softened a little bit because no one could quite remember why the ban had been put in place to begin with. But he stated that there must have been some reasons why this ban had been put in place. But it seemed that he made clear that the Minister of the Interior made clear that he was very open to the idea of Mennonite and Hutterites once again coming to Canada, but that no special treatment would be given, including exemption from military service. The question of their suitability as citizens of Canada, though, had not disappeared, and a few weeks later, this issue emerged once again, demonstrating that not everyone believed that Mennonites were capable of being assimilated. The Member of Parliament from Portage-la-Prairie, Harry Leader, was taken by surprise to learn that Mennonites and Hutterites could enter Canada once again, and he thought his constituents would be against such immigration, and he sort of reiterates some of the same points about assimilation and their problems adapting to Canada. At that time, the Minister of the Interior, Stewart, responded, kind of brushed off that question, and went straight into another issue which has relevance and significance for the Russlander, is that he started to state that his concern was that too many settlers were entering into the country who were, quote, mentally defective, and that he wanted to initiate more stricter medical examinations and have a careful scrutiny of these settlers, and to deport anyone who didn't physically or mentally fit into the category of a proper settler. And so, of course, this helps us to think about the incessant physical examinations that the Russlander will then undergo when they come to Canada during the 1920s. So this short case study, I think, reveals a few key themes that can be added to the discussion of the significance of the 1920s migration of Mennonites to Mexico. First, the controversy over the school question provided evidence for those who were arguing that Mennonites could not be assimilated and therefore should be banned from Canada. Other factors contributed to this ban, specifically ill will produced by the war and a growing discomfort with the idea of communal ownership of land. But the school question was a powerful symbol in this debate. Without access to the next generation through schools, it was clear that people at the national level felt that assimilation was not possible. Second, scholars have given attention to what the ban meant for people wanting to come to Canada without thinking much about what it meant to Canadian Mennonites to be deemed so undesirable as citizens that their kind had also been banned, and the effect that this would have on Mennonite communities who are struggling with other fractures within their communities created by the war, a pandemic, and then the exodus of their neighbors. So this ban created an incentive for Mennonites to identify themselves as, quote, progressive in order to define themselves in opposition to the Mennonites who were preparing to leave. And I think that a lot more work could be done on how this then shaped this Canadian Mennonite identity that it was developing at this time. And lastly, being, quote, our kind of Mennonite was a politically fleeting notion. So the label of undesirable will persist during the 1920s, even after the rescinding of the orders in council. There will be all sorts of protests that will take place when the immigration of the Russlander start in the 1920s, with letters being received by the government against this immigration. And of course, eventually, the King government will close the door to Mennonites, not officially through a ban, but just kind of not allowing the Mennonites who were stranded in Moscow to come out during 1929. So this kind of sense of Mennonites being undesirable will continue well into the 1920s. Thank you.
Han en tredje means there and back in Low German, my first language. I have always known that I was a descendant of a small but unpopular group of people who turned back from Paraguay after leaving Manitoba. This term for us, Rückkehrer, was used with cruel intent for an entire generation, ridiculing those who emigrated in the 1920s only to return shortly thereafter. This presentation will be an addendum to the usual 1920s emigration narrative, a minority report of two decisions. One, to sell everything that our family had in Manitoba to avoid compromising our faith in the 1920s, and the other, even more significant, to jettison everything in Paraguay a few years later to return to Manitoba and face that compromise. Since this conference will already examine the historical factors that prompted that mass immigration, I will refer only briefly to the causes and address more specifically the polarization that occurs within a people group when a question of ideals separates them. This had also happened in the 1870s immigration from Russia, as well as earlier migrations across Northern Europe. In each case, it took the shape of all kinds of negative interplay between the ones who felt they needed to emigrate to preserve their values and those who felt that they could adapt. In the 1920s, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the same polarization played out between the more liberal Mennonites and the conservative ones, dividing families and communities. Those who emigrated were denigrated by those who stayed, and vice versa. Then, about a year or so later, when some of the emigrants returned, that situation repeated itself. They were characterized as weaklings, or even cowards, in the face of the hardships of pioneering by those who toughed it out. And back in Manitoba, were ridiculed for not being able to live up to the high principles they professed. Since my Braun family had both experiences, together these two decisions placed my family in a no man's land. Now, from being key figures in the earliest immigration movement by 1929, they belonged to neither camp. Not to the group that stayed in Manitoba, nor to the group that remained in Paraguay. Those two decisions were to have repercussions far beyond those immediately foreseen. It all started, of course, as the school and language debate escalated after World War I, when my great-grandpa, Braun, in particular, lost faith in the Canadian government and became a vocal exponent of emigration. His daughter-in-law, my grandmother, a strong-minded, vivacious woman, likewise refused to stay in a land where the school would now be used to assimilate them into British citizens and would prepare her sons for the military instead of preparing them for an agrarian and communal life, ideally shaped by the Sermon on the Mount. It was too much to sacrifice once it became clear that another country would take them on acceptable terms. Consequently, in 1921, 65% of the Dietsche Mennonites on the East Reserve decided to emigrate. But a series of factors beyond their control postponed the actual migration for about 4 years. The entire emigration movement had been entrusted to General Samuel McRoberts, an American financier. He had made the original link to Paraguay and offered to fund and organize the land exchange, but a severe economic crisis struck all of North America in 1921, and he postponed his offer indefinitely. However, emigration was in motion, and before it became clear that the move was not going to happen anytime soon, the Browns had sold everything. The delay hit our family particularly hard, unlike those who only sold their land in 1926. That first decision had two parts, emigration and immigration, and no, they're not synonyms, each with financial and human costs. The emigration meant liquidating all material assets and leaving everything familiar for the unknown. Immigration meant encountering the unknown for good or ill. Emigration from my grandfather, Jacob Braun, was particularly devastating since as a successful farmer and partner in a threshing outfit, he was at age 35 in the prime of his life when in 1923-24 their farmstead in Altbergveld was sold lock, stock, and barrel to Winnipeg druggist William McCullough in a package deal of the entire village. Grandpa resisted strongly because he really did not want to emigrate, but his parents and his wife did, and so he resigned himself to it. When the emigration was delayed, Grandpa was forced to construct a temporary house and barn in primitive fashion near the village, and by selling garden produce and digging Seneca roots, his family avoided spending their capital, knowing they would need it for startup in Paraguay. Then by 1925, things improved, and McRoberts renewed his offer. Finally, in late 26, the Braun family left the train station at Carey with the first, yes, I think I've delayed my PowerPoint here. They left in the train station in 1926 with the first group in the middle of a blustery November night, traveling off to paradise, as they put it in their farewells. 3 years later, minus 57 days, they were to disembark from the train on the same train station in Carey, but they were not the same people. The family took a ship to Paraguay through Buenos Aires, arrived in Puerto Casado on December 31st, 1926, and everybody getting off the boat, the Apipi, that night was astounded to see electric lights on the shore. The safe arrival was telegraphed to Manitoba, but the second part of the decision became apparent within hours, namely that almost nothing had been done in Paraguay to settle them on their land. The land reserved for the Mennonites in the interior had not been surveyed. The railway that was supposed to provide access was not built. The overcrowded camp life with its unrelenting heat and insects made life miserable, and for the next 16 months, the immigrants were completely powerless to do anything about their situation, waiting either at Casado or one of the temporary camps inland with no income, no shelter, polluted water, poor diet, poor hygiene, almost impassable waterlogged landscape between them and the land they thought they had purchased. All these constituted a recipe for disaster, and it was not long in coming. Dysentery ravaged the tent camp from the start, taking small children almost weekly to the Catholic cemetery in Casado. My aunt remembered that at the time people were always singing. As a very little child, she did not realize what she was experiencing was a funeral every second day. Then the adults began to get sick, but poor medical care resulted in the many avoidable adult deaths of typhus in what was known as the Great Dying, das große Sterben. In our family, immigration brought disaster almost immediately. As grandmother became very ill, a German-speaking doctor in Casado could do nothing, but he said to my grandfather, "You have yourself to thank for this. What were you thinking, bringing a sick woman, pregnant woman with an abdominal hernia to this wilderness?" At the end, my grandmother sang Gesangbuch Song 247, translated, "Farewell world, I am tired of you and I want to go to heaven." Some of her last words were repeated to me 30 years ago by a bystander at her deathbed. "Well, since you want it that way, I guess I will have to die. Na, wanneer je dat zou willen, dan wou ik wel sterven moeten." These inexplicable words may have been addressed to God and not to the family, but they speak to the abject despair that she felt as she surrendered to her fate. After saying goodbye separately to each of her children, she died in agony after less than 90 days in paradise, that primeval Chaco that turned out to be a grotesque parody of Eden, where every plant bore thorns and barbs. There Grandpa was, with 6 little children, no wife, in a strange climate, culture, and language, in a place he didn't want to be, waiting for promises to be kept. An unusual, capable man. He was installed as camp manager and later operated the supply store at kilometer 135, while my father, as an 11-year-old, played in the river with the other boys, roughhousing, fishing, and in general having a grand time. In later years, he regaled my mother with tales of outrunning the train, walking around the tent camp on stilts, and nearly drowning in the river trying to rescue another boy. On the other hand, Grandpa's mindset can be seen in a conversation with his youngest daughter, Mary, on an evening's walk, possibly to see the grave of his wife in Casado Cemetery. And Mary told me 65 years later that she had complained of not being able to sleep at night. And Grandpa had said, "If you can't sleep at night, you simply must pray. Pray until you can." Her headstone says, "Rest easy in your grave until your Jesus calls you." Grandpa's sacrifices at emigration were the same as those of all the other immigrants. But as the immigration chapter began and his wife died, his spirit simply broke. And all he wanted was to return to Manitoba. Yet his father still existed some control over the finances, so he was trapped there, slowly using up his resources and biding his time until his father would decide in August of 1929 to use his last resources to take those who wanted back to Manitoba. The second decision arose out of the complications arising from the 3 same main issues: the long delay, the transport difficulty, all those, and the death of Grandmother Braun. The decision had its own unique complications, beginning already in Paraguay. Since emigration to Paraguay had been on a collective British passport, return to Canada would require an individual passport with all the personal details provided to the British consul in Asunción, as well as the signature of the group's leaders that these persons were in fact bona fide members of the group. After a stiff threat from the British consul, the settlement overseer, Alfred Rogers, reluctantly obliged. But the bishop declined, thus trapping everybody in Paraguay until many exhausted their resources to return to Manitoba. That was the final straw. They had no choice to stay with the group. That might go a long way to explain why 85% of the Manitoba group decided to stay. Out of utter brokenness of spirit, disillusionment with the project and its leaders, both secular and religious, and despairing of ever pioneering in the wilderness, My grandfather obtained his passport in Asunción and joined 2 other siblings to return with their parents. The Browns were fortunate. They were among the very few who had enough money to return without having to go into debt. Grandpa's father could still buy each of his sons a quarter section of unoccupied Métis grant land in the arm of de Salaberry, and here each son started over. When Grandpa obtained his quarter section, it was virgin scrubland, mainly bush, stones, and slough. Here they built a small house of saplings stacked up between uprights and covered with mud. Compared to the kind of house barn he left in Alt-Bergveld, now occupied by the newly arrived Russlaender, it must have been heartbreaking to see. That second decision kicked the entire Braun family down Maslow's hierarchy of needs right down to the bottom, where food and shelter became the entire focus, and all the wealth accumulated over 3 generations was wiped out, and startup from zero began in poor, unbroken land isolated from familiar ground and derisively called the Chaco by the neighbors. Those losses, in addition to the heartbreak of losing his wife, left Grandpa, once known as Grote Bruin, a shadow of his former self, to face startup in the Great Depression, and amid the ridicule of those in Paraguay and nearby. Nor did the damage stay with him. My father's life was disrupted, and instead of being a prosperous farmer, he was forced into day labor, and coming home from work one day, he was killed at age 40 by a drunk driver. Even my own childhood was impacted. Only when I finished high school and 2 older siblings had sacrificed school and career did the consequences of the decisions abate. In conclusion, in view of the disastrous beginning in Paraguay, why did only 15% of the settlers despair and return? There's really no answer to that. In fact, this is the question that was raised at both decisions, the question of breaking point. At departure immigration, the question was how much compromise can we live with before we leave? At arrival, it was how much misery can we live with before we leave? The answer to these 2 questions varied with each settler. It should have been noted that the families that emigrated were already the ones that had a high standard of principle and high tolerance for hardship, and coming from poor land in the East Reserve had less to lose. All the more difficult is it to discover why even 15% of these hardy pioneers eventually gave up. Today, who knows in advance the breaking point of a person's spirit? Today, I have many relatives in Paraguay whose descendants of families whose spirit did not break. They survived and thrived. As my great-uncle Abraham said to me in Loma Plata in 1973, the first generation, it's death. The second, it's need. And the third generation, it's food security. He did not address the 4th generation, but today they are prosperous, successful, business professionals. So although almost everything that could go wrong in this wildly outrageous endeavor did go wrong, the vast majority of pioneers carried through despite the cost. As Alfred Rogers said, we will not find another people who would do what these Mennonites did. However, for our family, I must conclude that in the first decision, principle trumped compromise, despite the cost. In the second decision, the cost trumped everything. However, throughout Mennonite history, emigration on religious principle was absolutely irreversible. And if anyone did turn back, it was an unforgivable betrayal of that principle. That was the ultimate price of our return to Manitoba. About 40 years ago, I bought an antique clock from a retired farmer in Grunthal, also out of Kehler, who told me he had emigrated in 27. Disillusioned and broke, he had been unable to return. But somebody gave him the money, and although that person came back himself, he never asked for the money back. That person was my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Jacob Braun. Broken in spirit and despairing of a future, this same Braun family had compassion on another desperate family and demonstrated a greater principle: love thy neighbor. Whenever I see that clock on my desk, I'm reminded of how I came to be here, by a return perhaps as costly to Grandpa's spirit as the death of his wife. I understand, but within the bounds of Mennonite humility, I hold my head high.
Okay, first a little bit about Marie and the Minnows. So this is a TV show that is going to start filming in January, and all 13 episodes are going to be airing on Yes TV. It is about a young Mennonite man who marries a young Filipino woman in Winnipeg, and they move in with his parents in Winkler, and hilarity shall ensue. So keep your ears and eyes tuned for that next fall. Okay, now on to my paper. So this family history follows in the footsteps of Arletta Cowan-Hoffen, whose book, The Fairs, follows the trajectory of one family's migration from Holland to Mexico. Hans Werner, who conducted similar research on the Suderman family, states about Cowan-Hoffen's work, "We can learn much about the bigger questions of history by focusing closely on the details of a single family." This is a story about Anna Clausen and Peter Fehr and their descendants, my grandparents. It encapsulates the last 100 years of history from the time of the Old Colony Mennonites' initial migration to Mexico. I sought to explore the history of and construct a narrative about the failed migration to Belize that I had heard about growing up, the death of the family matriarch, and certain undiscussed events that I imagined had fragmented the Fehr family, spreading them across the Americas. I interviewed my father, Jacob Fehr, my Aunt Judith from Oklahoma, and Aunt Elizabeth, who lives in Mexico, as well as Helen Sawatsky, the daughter of my deceased Aunt Anne, who lived near Winkler. I had also access to letters written to my grandfather by his children and sisters. And like much other writing, a lot of this history has been left on the floor. Literally, actually, because the letters are still on my floor in my office. Migration from Russia to Canada to Mexico. My grandfather, Peter Fehr, was born in Neuenberg Village, Manitoba, Canada in 1912, the 9th of 14 living children of Helena Dell and Jacob Fehr, who were married in 1876, shortly after both of their families' arrival to Manitoba. My grandmother, Anna Clausen, was born in 1913, the third of only 7 children, to Johann Clausen and Ida Judith Boylig. Ida's parents, Caroline Hochstein and Wilhelm Boylig, came from Saxon, Germany to settle near the West Reserve. I have always found this mixed marriage curious. In my research, I discovered that it is most likely because Ida Judith was introduced to the Mennonites in Neuenberg since her brother Ernest was a school teacher there from 1906 to 1908. Another curiosity for a non-Mennonite to be teaching in a Mennonite school. Also, 2 of Ernst's own daughters also married into the Clausen and Fehr families who migrated to Mexico. My grandparents were about 10 years old when they migrated with their parents and many of their aunts and uncles to Neuenberg Village in Mexico. In fact, 23 of the 29 families from Neuenberg, Manitoba, migrated to Mexico, in large part because the bishop, Johann Friesen, lived in that village, a curious precipitating factor for migration for my ancestors. And to borrow from Ernest Braun, there and back again, migration to Belize. This is a similar story. After their marriage in 1937 in Mexico, my grandparents lived in a house across the street from his parents. With a growing family, they faced a perennial dilemma. My father, Jacob Fehr, said they needed more land. The land was getting scarce, and they, other Mennonites, were talking about how good it was there in Belize. It was cheap. The people told them all good kinds of stuff from there. They told them you could sit in the house and pick your fruit, oranges, bananas, just reach out of the window. But then when we got there, then Dad said, "That's not for white people." This land, that is. So misperceptions and misrepresentations of prospective land is a typical theme throughout Mennonite migrations. My grandparents, like others before and after them, relied upon colony leaders and the traditional wisdom of, we'll see how it works out yet. Prior to leaving Mexico, Peter and Anna had sold almost everything, including their house in Neuenberg, to his 4 unmarried sisters who all lived with their widowed mother. They loaded up what they could on a bus along with 10 children, including their oldest daughter, who was married with a 1-year-old and an infant. My father said a recent hurricane had washed out roads and bridges, so the bus had to be driven onto large barges, and ferried across. All the research that I did never spoke about that hurricane, though. The place where the Mennonites were living was only accessible by boat. When asked what they did when they first landed, my father said, "Well, we got there during the night. There was sort of a road, an airstrip. My dad and I don't know who else, they walked. Further down there was somebody living there already, an Isaac Reimer. He had one of these little gray Fordson tractors and a trailer already, and he came with that, and we loaded our stuff on there and went to, I think it was Jake Peters. They had built a house already, but they had a big family too, and for some reason, we stayed at their place. Then for the rest of the time that we were there, we lived at my dad's cousin's place." The small house was built with an ovenseed, a shed built onto an already existing outer wall of a building, which was where the boys slept. My Aunt Elizabeth, who was 13 years old at the time, said that the girls slept in the house. We lay on blankets that we had spread out, and we slept all in a row on the floor. It was so hot, we didn't need to cover ourselves. She also said that there were 9 houses for newcomers. Watsky says there were 10. But my father had said that they had been occupied since the initial migrants had not built their own homes and had not vacated them. The quick decision to return to Mexico had immediate effects on the practical matters of daily life. Something that was not of concern to my father, though it was to Aunt Elizabeth, who said, "The bugs were bad. We didn't have anything to make food, and Father didn't want to get anything together so that we could make food because he just wanted to go back to Mexico. It was not enjoyable." Perhaps the fact that raising children was also outside of the boys' sphere was the reason my father never told me about the death of his sister Anne's oldest son. In the 1987 edition of Strangers and Pilgrims, Abe Workington writes, "A terrible tragedy occurred when, despite warnings, children were allowed to drink water that had not been boiled, and more than 35 died in one 6-week period in May and June 1958. Several years before my Aunt Anne passed away, she told me about her son Jacob's death. I asked my cousin Helen, her daughter, what her mom had told her about it. And she said there was a flu that went around, and many of the smaller children died, but infants were not affected. My family's prevailing understanding is that it was this tropical climate and its newness that killed these young children. Aunt Judith said, "My oldest sister, Anne, had 2 children. The oldest died there because of the climate, but the next one, she was breastfeeding him, and he made it through it." From the way they spoke about it, the breastfeeding was not linked to not drinking contaminated water, but that it imbued the baby with a sort of form of protection. I asked my Aunt Judith, who was 19 years old at the time, how they dealt with it all, and if there was a preacher there. She said there was a preacher who held an Ofdank, a service, and then they went and buried him. They'd figured out where to have a graveyard there. There were many other kids who died. That was very hard for us all. I went to the edge of the woods and stood there and cried, because I didn't want to see him die. Our brother Henry got very sick too, and then my dad said that we had to go back before he died too. Henry was 6.5 years old at the time. All told, their adventure took them 1 month, but took a toll on the family. It took about a week to get to Belize, and within 2 weeks of being there, the decision was made to return. And upon the return to Cuauhtémoc, Mexico, the family could have bought back the house they had sold to Grandpa Peter's sisters, but it had only become a stopping place. The move from Neuenberg to Rosenthal and Grandma's demise. When asked why they had not stayed in Neuenberg, my father said that his mother said, "No, we have all our relatives here." I thought that was curious. Aunt Elizabeth said she wanted to move somewhere else because, as she said, all the siblings were living there and they wanted something new. There were arguments among the siblings. Sometimes some would gang up on another sibling. They would tell each other how to live. They were in each other's business all the time. So living near each other means family members can support each other. But just as often, I have heard it said by Dietsche in the years that I worked for MCC that it's best not to live too near one's siblings, since doing so always provokes arguments. When I asked Aunt Elizabeth for an example of something that would have caused an argument, she said, "Well, you know about the 4 sisters who lived together? They may have given Grandpa Peter something, and then the others would be jealous over that. They would ask why they had not gotten something." The 4 sisters, Maria, Anna, Eva, and Aganita, were all unmarried and lived with their mother, Helena, Martin's Fehr, who had been widowed since 1935, shortly after their arrival to Mexico. Well, this is a typical arrangement for unmarried colony Mennonites. According to inheritance practices, they had an equal portion of the land that they rented out, and thus they had money to lend. Much more could be said about these sisters and the existence of unmarried women in Mennonite colonies. Growing up, I was under the impression that my grandparents had come back poor and penniless, and while that may have been the case, through their family's support, they were able to rebound. They moved to Rosenthal to an old rundown house, sold their 80 acres in Neuenberg, and bought 160 acres with money borrowed from Grandpa Peter's sisters and mother. They needed to borrow this money since they had incurred a lot of debt in moving to Belize and returning. Because of other families continuing to migrate to Belize, Bolivia, and Paraguay at that time, they were able to buy a farmhouse and land with ease. However, because they could not settle in an area with sufficient land to settle their children, actually, I should say that was actually only migrating to Belize at that time. My apologies. However, because they could not settle in an area with sufficient land to settle their children, Peter and Anna's family began dispersing. The eldest daughter, Anna's family, moved with them to Rosenthal and then moved from one colony to another in Chihuahua over the years. The next 2 daughters, Helena and Judith, had a double falafnis and wedding. The falafnis is the engagement party that's held a week before the wedding. And the wedding was held on June 28, 1959, which precipitated their own departures from home. Judith and her new husband, Isaac Dick, moved far south to the Santa Rita colony, while Helena and her husband, Isaac Harms, moved to his parents' yard in Rhineland and later bought a place across the street from them. In the spring of 1961, tragedy struck again. Anna, my grandmother, became ill with bone cancer. Aunt Elizabeth said, "I was 14 then. She was sick, and at first she still went about the house, but then for about a year, she only lay down. The other girls were married and moved away, and I had to take care of her by myself." Their brother Peter and Elizabeth Reimer married in June of 1961, shortly after Grandma Fehr became ill, and the couple moved to her parents' place, since her parents had bought land in Bolivia and were waiting to immigrate. In December of that year, their sister Susanna married Johann Thiessen and remained on the family farm in Rosenthal. Along with my grandmother's daughter Elizabeth, 4 younger boys, including my father, remained at home. Her illness was most difficult for the youngest son, Heinrich, who was 9 years old at the time and sensitive by nature. My grandfather had taken Grandma to a hospital in Chihuahua City where a doctor wrote a letter stating the nature of her illness. The letter was interpreted by a local self-taught doctor, Johann Entz. This is the first time I'd heard about Johann Entz. Little could be done for her, though, except to give her medication for pain, and so she succumbed to her illness in July of 1962. Another pivotal moment. A failed marriage and an act of violence. Grandpa Peter, like most men in his situation, sought a wife and mother for his remaining 5 children. He courted the widow Helena Wiebe from Hochfeld. I had never known that he had been married for a second time, either growing up, because the events that followed were shameful. My father says it was Grandpa's biggest mistake to marry and move in with her in Hochfeld, or Hochfeld. I'm going to use both names. I do it all the time. The widow Helen Wiebe and her married son Klaus were very domineering. The widow's first husband had been meek, but the same could not be said for my grandfather. My Aunt Elizabeth said, quote, "They were together for 2.5 years. It was terrible. They were always only mad at each other." What made matters worse was that the stepchildren's uncle was their goutman, or warden, and he enjoyed stirring up trouble on the stepchildren's behalf. During this tumultuous time in Hochfeld, 3 more siblings got married and hitched their wagons to their spouses' families. First, my father married in 1965 and remained in Hochfeld, since that's where my mother was from, but lived closer to my maternal grandmother's place. My grandfather sent my Aunt Elizabeth to live with the David Peters in Hochfeld to get away from the fighting. Are you serious? 5 minutes? Oh, man, okay. She was there for a year before she got married to Jacob Friesen and moved to his village of Rheinfeld, where they lived on the parents' yards. And in 1969, my Uncle John married Agatha Peters, moving to her village of Burwalde. The animosity that developed between Grandpa Peter and his stepsons and the turbulent nature of the marriage led to a serious altercation between Grandpa and his adult stepson, Johann. When asked what happened, Aunt Judith said simply, "They were mad at each other, and Dad had told Johann not to come to the house. But he did, and my dad shot him in the leg." I had heard this story for the first time in my 20s from my Aunt Anne. When I asked my father about it, his angry reaction about my hearing about it stopped me from ever talking to him about it again. Even in this most recent interview, he still didn't bring it up. Contrary to the general modus operandi of the colony, Mexican police were involved, which led to my grandfather's incarceration in a Mexican jail for several months. Aunt Anne said that she had to bring him food since Mexican prisons did not provide adequately for prisoners. Upon his release, he moved in with Anne and her family and got his papers together to return to Canada. It seems that my grandfather was excommunicated from the Old Colony Church, and it's my suspicion that it's this that led him and his only unmarried adult son, Cornelius, to leave for Canada and move to Winnipeg, of all places, instead of to rural southern Manitoba, where he had family. Early letters from Cornelius to his father express his thanks to his father for bringing him out from those devils, meaning the Mennonite Gemeinde, and for providing him the opportunity to live a more free and less judgmental existence. This was not only in one letter, but in several. Only a few years after his arrival, he legally changed his name to Chris, a radical move to shed his Mennonite identity. So after establishing him in Canada, my grandpa returned to Mexico to retrieve his now adult son, Henry, who was in the terrible care of his sister, Susanna, who treated Henry as though he were incompetent, though most likely he'd been suffering from trauma. At some point in my youth, I understood that he suffered from schizophrenia and was under the care of a psychiatrist. So Grandpa brought Uncle Henry to live with him in Winnipeg, where he was established at de Fehr's Furniture and worked there until he retired. So my grandfather returned to Mexico in '72 and helped my family come to Canada. And so that's a whole nother story. 2 of my other aunts and uncles' families migrated to the United States in the 1970s. My Aunt Judith attempted to come into Canada, but they were rejected, and so went to Corn, Oklahoma. Yes, it's actually a place. Corn is a place in Oklahoma. Here, Isaac had bought equipment, sold it in Mexico in the past, and so he worked for a Mennonite farmer, Joel Gosen, though I don't know if they knew that they were Mennonites. My Uncle John and Aunt Agatha were part of a failed attempt by a group of old colony Mennonites from Cotamook to establish a colony around Seminole, Texas. So I tell you, tragedy after tragedy. All right. The rest of the older siblings moved to Bolivia and to Paraguay and have remained there, and all of their family has remained there as well. And my Aunt Anne tried to move to Paraguay. That didn't work, and so she came to Manitoba in 1979. So only one of my father's siblings remained in Mexico, and the rest were scattered across the Americas. And so for years, I wondered about what caused all of this. And so through these interviews and letters, I've been able to pick apart some of the reasons why. And a lot of it had to do with, again, poor decisions and terrible circumstances and this terrible, violent incident that happened in Mexico. That's it. There's more, but that's it for now.
Thank you, everyone. We have about 25 minutes for questions. Ben tells me that there are 56 people watching this conference on the webinar live stream right now. So hello, all you out there on the internet. They have a question and answer feature as well for submitting questions, so we may have some questions coming in from the web. We also have a roving microphone, so if anyone here has a question for our panelists, please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you.
Okay, here we go. I'll start over. Bruce, you had a set of data showing declining birth rates among women in Manitoba, but that data, at least as you showed it, was not linked to livelihood. It is my understanding that the Manitoba Mennonites also have the lowest rate of agrarian lifestyle, especially over time. And I'm wondering if, now you were only looking at 3 families, maybe they all stayed in that kind of lifestyle, but as economic differentiation occurred, I'm wondering if there's a linkage there between the move away from an agrarian lifestyle and declining birth rate.
Great question, and I can't answer it absolutely, except to say that this decline starts at the turn of the century, so that the actual decline is measurable by 1900. Now, it's small at that point, and they're completely agrarian at that point. And it's already declining, and it declines in a line. And as far as I can tell from research in terms of the families, there really isn't much migration to the city until the 1950s. That is, these are agrarian families with rapidly declining family size. This is really odd. It's a good question. Maybe there is a peculiarity here, and the really agrarian ones all went to Mexico, and they'd already. I can't tell though. But a good question, but it doesn't seem to quite fit the data. The question that it seems to drive the data more is why the later age of marriage for the women? Because most of the fertility, not all of it, but most of the fertility decline can be put to that one feature. If women marry at 19 versus marrying at 26, that 7-year period is 3 to 4 babies. And that pretty much takes care of it. But it's a linear decline. So there's a lot that I don't know that what exactly is going on with those particular families. I'm more interested, I think it's more why the late age of marriage for the women? Can I just follow up with that? I think this is one of the areas that needs more examination. That is, we know that the public voices of the Mennonite communities were men, but what was happening with the women? Was there a completely different women's dialogue that was non-printed, non-public dialogue around what is the correct practices? What does it mean to be Mennonite from a female perspective, outside of the formal church structures and the thinking of the bishops? I've run into this in a number of communities, and it's highly suggestive that there's a women's network that is making decisions quite independent of the formal men's structure. But it's not in print. This is not in print. So somebody's got to start talking. Go talk to your grandmothers and ask what happened.
Maybe this is Hans Werner. This is a question for both Tina and Ernie. Such a diaspora of family is really not unusual among people from Latin America, where family is all over the place. I'm curious about how much contact is there between the different articulations of this family over these wide spaces?
So the letters that my grandfather has, there are only a handful of letters from all of his children spanning from 1972 to 1977, about, just a handful. The most prolific writer was my Aunt Anne, and she wrote, there's a thick stack of letters. There's probably about 40 of them, until her migration here to Canada. So there was some, but a lot of the times when I was reading letters, and this is where it gets tricky, is because so-and-so told me that they had a letter from so-and-so, and so they read that letter to me. So there is this, the passing on of letters or of information from one family to another. So one family may have written a letter, but that letter was read by multiple people. And also, please send greetings to, this other family. I don't have their address, but, send greetings to them. So there was a lot of that. But my father did not communicate with any of his siblings, or very, very infrequently. My Uncle Peter from Bolivia came and visited once, and I have a picture to prove that I'd met him when I was very small. My grandpa went to Mexico several times throughout his life. Interestingly enough, my Uncle Chris, who no longer associated with being a Mennonite, took my Uncle Henry to Bolivia in the early 2000s to visit his brother and sister there. Other than that, it seems like this fragmentation in the family just really caused a split between my father and the rest of the siblings. And it seems from some of the letters from my Uncle Chris that the thought was that, Peter had thought he was just too good for everybody else, and so didn't really want to have anything to do with all of those heathens. So I think those are some of those factors that play into that.
In my family, it got a little more splintered because two of those siblings that came back in 1929 returned to Ostparaguay in 1948. So it got even more splintered than before. And of those, one of them came back and the other one stayed. But I remember, my father was killed when I was only 8 years old, so I don't have a whole lot of memories of that time frame. But he always got whatever the equivalent paper was of the Mennoblad. It arrived very punctually at our house. I remember it was always wrapped in a very neat coil, and my dad would read it religiously. So we had that kind of formal contact. The letters I'm not aware of, again, because my father died when I was too young to know. But we have been in touch with that family. I went to visit my family there in early 1970s. And our people and our families visit down there fairly frequently. And they, of course, come up here to study. They come up here on vacation. So there's probably more contact in the last 20 years with my family in Paraguay than there was in the previous 75. And mainly the reason there was the contact was so limited is logistical. It was just too expensive to travel. But the letter writing, I think a lot of it happened through the Steinbach Post, because those letters were shared, and there was always the indication, Franz, warum schreibst du nicht? Frank, why aren't you writing? And this was from all sides of my family. So I think the contact was actually not broken that badly. Considering all the circumstances we lived through, I didn't sense a huge rift there. More from the people here, sorry to say.
If I could ask all the questioners to identify themselves, that would be appreciated. The first questioner, I believe, was Tracy Ruschka, and the second was Hans Werner.
And I am Priscilla Reimer. Back to Bruce. Makes me curious, you know, in other words, you're willing now to suggest that baby deaths of the first 12 months may not have been recorded at all. And the question is, I'm not sure we can answer it, is how much of Mennonite history is actually unrecorded? I've done, you know, I recall doing a translation together with my Aunt Sarah for one of Dr. Royden's books, and we consciously chose the year in which my Auntie Sarah was born, because on the day that she was born, a woman came to the house, and by the end of the day, a baby had been born. Well, that was the midwife. But if you didn't know it was the midwife, it would mean, like to my nieces and nephews, that would be a completely meaningless entry. So my question is, how much of Mennonite history is actually not on the record, and even what is, how reliable is some of it? Because we seem to have a habit of avoiding the things that make us uncomfortable.
Oh, that's a lovely question, and it raises so many issues. Okay, again, going back to the question, is there a women's history as opposed to a men's history? And the women's history is person-to-person, verbal, oral communication. And in particular, the role of the midwives. I am still waiting for a good analysis of midwives and midwifery in Mennonite communities. I haven't seen it. Is there one? I know Marlene Epp's work, but that's related to Russia. And I mean, there's a lot going on. And for example, from my mother, I know that there was information on how to have an abortion circulating in women's networks within the Mennonite communities. So there's a lot of stuff going on verbally, orally, and it's just not being recorded. And then the only reason I say there's got to be a lot of deaths is because otherwise nothing makes any sense. You can't control fertility in the way the numbers come out of the Mennonite books. I mean, one issue I haven't raised here, it's in some of the other material I've got. 1923 in southern Manitoba is the year of no boys. It's like baby boy births are just fractional. What's going on in that year? And I think it has to do with, actually, just a lot of them got sick and they're going, yeah, we're all going to move to Paraguay. It's the Sommerfelder. So we're just not going to nurse them back to health. It's just too much work, which is a very common decision in the literature about women making that decision. This one's just sickly, and you know, we got a lot coming. I'm just not going to really put the effort into nursing them back to health. That's well documented, not in Mennonite circles, but elsewhere. So it's like there's a lot of research that could be done here to figure out what is going on. But I don't notice, it's like we're asking, we're asking men's history. We're not asking women's history. And I think that needs to change because I think it's a really vibrant and different women's history in the Mennonite circles.
To add to that, my grandma was a midwife in Mexico, and she attended over 1,000 births. And I asked my dad once if there was any record of that, and he cried because, and my dad did not cry very often, he cried because he said that all of those records had been burnt because it was meaningless to a lot of people. Like, history was just meaningless. Like, why would you want to keep this? Like, we just have to live this day. We have to live now.
Interesting.
Also, maybe if I can jump in here, the attitude of that pioneering and that liminal moment when you're moving from one country to the next and you're pioneering. One expression that came through in my family is when I asked one of the ladies about that experience, she said she had just had a baby, aber das Kind kann sterben, meaning, but the child could die and it was seen as a positive.
I'm Bob Hummelt, and this is for Dr. Friesen, Aileen. If the government, particularly the federal government, could discern between the different kinds of Mennonites, no doubt the Mennonites themselves could do so as well. What was the discourse between those different kinds of Mennonites before they left and when they returned?
Yeah, and I might just state that the government could discern between different kinds of Mennonites, but it also could not discern between different types of groups. So for instance, and this is something that hasn't been fully recognized enough in Mennonite history in general, the association of Mennonites with Hutterites and back and forth is very strong, and that's also strong in the 1870s when there's another point of issue in Imperial Russia over migration. And so we should recognize that just because the government can categorize people, sometimes they miscategorize people and also use some information to make decisions that isn't necessarily reflective of the community that they're targeting. But yes, of course, Mennonites could distinguish between themselves, and there becomes a competition between the idea of Mennonite and what that means. And it is another topic and issue that hasn't been fully investigated about how Mennonites who wanted to distance themselves from the controversy, and obviously they're wrapped up in the controversy through exemption from military service, which is the same for all, but they're trying to distance themselves from the school question controversy, and there are groups that will attempt to represent their case and represent sort of their contribution to Canadian society and emphasize, you know, for 40 years we've incorporated English into our schools, we have teachers that are well trained, and this is our way in which we have contributed to Canada. And they make this point very clearly to government officials in an attempt to distinguish themselves from the other groups. And one thing that I'm interested in, then how does this affect dialogues between groups? And we often think that there are these, I mean, there obviously are splits between congregations, there are splits between different ways of being Mennonites that are very clear, but there are also relationships between those splits. So there are family relations, there's all sorts of ways in which people are kind of bound together, and how that affected dynamics between families, dynamics between friends, dynamics in specific communities is still, I think there's a lot more work to be done on that.
Name is Kennert Giesbrecht. First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers. I found all your presentations fascinating, very interesting. Ernie, or Ernest, I want to talk to your story. Very, very interesting. Kind of touches my family history as well. I was amongst, or my ancestors, my grandparents, great-grandparents were amongst those that stayed strong and stayed in Paraguay. It's maybe not a question that I want to ask, just I figured I could maybe mention this to you later on privately, but I also felt others might be interested in this. This story that you told is still happening. I just spoke to people from migration that happened over the last year, like started in April, May of 2021. About 50-some families from Ontario moved to Bolivia. And several families, 3 of them actually, moved back to Ontario within a few months. And I spoke to people that have stayed in Bolivia, and also to one of the families that came back, and they tell exactly this story, how they were kind of looked down upon from people in Ontario when they left. Now they are being looked down on by people that have stayed in Bolivia, roughly 50, I think 51 families currently. They don't feel accepted back here in Ontario because they had sold everything. They need to rebuild their lives. Kind of the same reasons that they came back are the reasons that you talked about in your story. So just, yeah, it's still happening. Migrations are happening all over the place. Mennonites are always on the lookout for land, a new beginning, challenges, a lot of challenges that you talk about in your story they're still facing. So, and yeah, I'll leave it up to discussion if those are challenges that are self-inflicted, or like back then, yeah, it was a voluntary move to Paraguay, but most people that made that migration to Paraguay in 1926, 1927 probably felt it was something they had to do, yeah.
Well, and your comment, like your story makes me think maybe this is one of the reasons, another reason for the fragmentation of my family that didn't make it in Belize. They came back, maybe that's why they didn't want to stay in Neuenberg, because the siblings may have been like, talking to them like, oh, you terrible people, why did you not stay, and now you're back. So I can see maybe that may have been one of the reasons why my grandma didn't want to stay in Nuremberg, to hear that criticism.
Yeah, I think it's also a matter of one cannot actually anticipate in advance what one's breaking point is. And I think we underestimate how often that plays out in these migrations, and often explains some of the brokenness that is experienced back here. But the underlying floor of this, I think, is that premise in Mennonite circles that if you emigrate for religious reasons, that is an irreversible decision. And if you do violate that, you ultimately have betrayed everything.
My name is Conrad Stace, and this is a question for Bruce. In your early slide, you talk about the grandma database as being the source for your research. My question is, how have you ensured that the data in the database is accurate and complete?
Good question. Put it this way, my doctoral research all depended on the grandma database, so I explored that question. It is phenomenally accurate from a statistical point of view. However, any specific piece of information in it may be wrong. Okay? So I tested out for where I could check against external sources for hundreds of points of data and found it was like a 98, 99% accuracy, but 1 to 2% inaccuracy. Now, from my point of view as a statistician, that's irrelevant. But if you're trying to track your own independent family, be careful.
We've got a couple remote questions as well from our audience on Zoom. So one of them, Ernie, for you, there was just a passing reference, Daryl asks, to Mennonites returning and settling on Métis Reserve land. Can you speak to that just a little bit more? And then I'll just add in, because I think there's another question in the room. Certainly for Bruce, you sparked some interest as well about the data. Eddie Rempel over there in Omer was wondering aspects of verifying that for if it's a small sample size. And Linda Thiessen in BC is also wondering the degree to which, and you've addressed this a bit, Mennonite women would be interested in speaking to male Mennonite researchers about the topic that you've proposed. But we'll leave it for Ernie to answer.
Yes, it's actually a bit of an interesting scenario with that grant land. Contrary to statistical odds, I actually tracked down a descendant of the original person that land was granted to way back in the 1870s. And I asked her point blank, what record is there in your family of who lived on that land? And she emails back and she says, there is no evidence in my family tree of us ever living there, and there isn't even any reference to us ever in the family of ever owning that land or receiving it as a grant. But I checked the provincial records, and yes, they did receive it as a grant. So this is one of those situations where speculators, like that whole travesty of the Mennonite grant lands played out, and this is in just below the arm of Hanover into the arm of de Salaberry. As you all know, St. Pierre in that area is an old settlement and a prosperous settlement, but this is actually east of St. Malo, about 6 miles. And as we often say in my circles, the world ended a mile north of where I was born. Då hungas development pankukatau. They shut off the horizon with pancakes. And I was born about 1.5 miles south of that pancake curtain into that land. And half of my family, the ones that returned, all ended up within about 1 mile of each other in that area. And I was born on the Métis Grant land owned by a family named Tourond. And if you'll see my name plaque, I live in Tourond and have for 42 years.
One last question.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
My name is Natalia Wenger, and my question to Aileen Friesen. So, Aileen, you mentioned briefly about the discussions in Canada before the Russlaenders came to Canada. And so my question is about, because you know context and you know background, were there any differences between the sentiments about Mennonites from Russia when Canada was waiting for Canadian and Russlaender? Thank you.
Maybe I'll just let Bruce first answer his question from before, and then I'll answer.
Okay. What was the question? The statistical accuracy. Okay. If anybody's interested in really exploring in detail, it is a fascinating. The GRAMA database is probably more accurate than your family records as they currently exist. It's not necessarily accurate to the historical record. One of the things is most families make lots of errors when they're collecting the data. And I'll tell you, from looking at tens of thousands of records, women lie about their age. Okay? It's just obvious. It just happens all over. But you can track the same woman through multiple records, and her age keeps dropping. And this is hundreds of years of data. So anyway, so your family records might not be actually. Your grandma might have been a couple years or older than born. Anyway, and the GRAMA database might have that accurately, and your family records might not. So there's work if you really want precision. It's absolutely accurate. You're going to have to do a lot of digging. Your family records are probably not accurate. GRAMA is probably more accurate than that, but GRAMA is not perfect.
So I'll just answer Natalia's question. Yes, so there is this concerted effort in order to present Mennonites coming from Russia in a very positive light, to emphasize their abilities with languages, their willingness to integrate, their levels of education and their commitment to that. And Canadian Mennonites who remain in Canada are helping Mennonites from Russia construct this narrative about themselves. And so there's a dialogue between both sides, the Canadian Mennonites who are trying to help facilitate this Russlaender migration and Russlaender representation in Canada, particularly through AA Friesen, to push forward this idea of these Mennonites being really the type of settlers that you want to welcome to Canada. And they managed to convince at least some minds of key officials that this is the case, but there is still a lot of resentment in Western Canada surrounding this migration when it starts. And I just want to also mention, because there's been a lot of talk about the history of Mennonite women, that in fact history about Mennonite women has been done. I mean, there's even a collection at Mennonite Heritage Archives about women and birth giving. I think it's not necessarily in the time frame we're talking about here, but there is large collections, and I think that one of the issues that we've been facing is that a lot of times female historians have been conducting these histories and they haven't been listened to, so that there's this ways in which their voices have been are available but have been made absent by our lack of use of them. So I would encourage people to go out and read some Mennonite history written by Mennonite women and help revive those voices that are so essential to answering these types of questions.
Hi, my name is Leonard Dole, and I have a comment to make about thanks, first of all, for all your presentations. I really enjoyed what you had to contribute. In terms of the comments about fudging or birth dates or the ages of children, in some of the work that I've done in Saskatchewan around Mennonites that moved to Mexico and South America, the first Mennonites in southern Saskatchewan landed up moving in 1922 to Mexico. The rest of those that went after 1924 and 26 continued to pay fines and lose assets, and assets seized, for another 3 or 4 years, similar to your experience, Ernest, that you talked about. So what happened is that people would fudge birth dates in order for the fines not to happen. So when the JP would come to their yard and ask, how many children do you have and how old are they, the children would not be of school age in order for them not to have to pay fines. So that might have contributed to some of the way, the resilience or the way of people learn to survive just through those years, and through poverty and some of the challenges they face. So that might be another factor in both of your presentations. The question I have would be for Aileen, and that has to do with the Friesen Braun trials and how that might have contributed to the sense of our people not being desirable newcomers to Canada.
I can say from the at least the debates that is not playing into the evidence that's being raised in the House of Commons in terms of arguments for banning Mennonites. But in terms of public opinion that is also influencing the political process, I mean, potentially there could be some elements of that. I forget when Hans will tell me, when was the trial? Was it 20? So it's a later period for sort of influencing that original debate about banning, but definitely that will potentially play into, I haven't looked at sort of this shift that happens again. So we close, then we open, and then we kind of close again unofficially to Mennonite immigration. And so that trial could play a role in that sort of latter point in which it becomes no longer acceptable for more Mennonites to be brought in from the Soviet Union.
Thank you, everyone, for a very good question period. I'd like to invite you all to thank once again the presenters for a very good start to our conference.